DisplayPort 2.1 is the latest generation of DisplayPort connectivity that's slowly making its way to the display market, but there are 5 major problems with it that we need to talk about really today. These are not widely understood, and there's a lot of hype and misinformation about this new connection. So we'll try and explain in detail what the problems are, the key things you need to understand and look out for, and we'll also tackle the question as to why DisplayPort 2.1 hasn't really been used much so far. In case you've not heard about this new connection type, the marketing promotion will tell you that it offers 3 times the bandwidth of the previous DisplayPort 1.4 generation, up to a whopping 80 gigabits per second in fact. The key benefit of this higher bandwidth is that it opens the door for higher resolutions and refresh rates, as well as potentially uncompressed signals and images in some cases, where you don't need to then rely on display stream compression. That gets a bit of a bad rap actually from some users. That's the theory anyway, but the reality isn't necessarily what you'd expect. There's really 2 key reasons then why people are excited about DP 2.1. Firstly, as we said, it makes it possible to support even higher resolutions and refresh rate combinations, which simply aren't possible over DP 1.4, even with the highest DSE compression. Current display options like 4K 240Hz and 1440p 480Hz are pushing the limits of DP 1.4 connections already that use DSC, and future combinations such as 4K 360Hz, 5K 2K 240Hz, or massive resolutions like dual 4K at 240Hz, like we've already seen actually on models like the 57-inch Samsung Odyssey G95NC, simply can't be covered by DP 1.4 at all. These cutting-edge and future display capabilities need the newer DP 2.1 connection with the new speeds that it can offer. DP 1.4 just isn't going to be enough. Supporting these kind of advancements are really the primary use case for DP 2.1. The second reason people are interested in DP 2.1 is that in theory it could allow you to run some of the existing resolutions and refresh rate combinations with an uncompressed video signal, and therefore without needing to use display stream compression or DSC at all. So for instance, a 4K 240Hz display using DP 1.4 now has to use DSC to support that, whereas a full 80 gigabits per second bandwidth DP 2.1 connection could potentially handle 4K 240Hz without DSC. DSC is a visually lossless compression algorithm, and we, along with other well-known reviewers, have never really experienced any issues with image quality or seen any differences between DSC image and an uncompressed image in practice. We think that 99% of all users would never be able to tell the difference or even spot issues where DSC is used. So there's no need to worry about DSC from that point of view. It doesn't cause any additional lag either, so no worries there. However, there are some issues that bother some people with DSC, mostly when connected to older systems and to NVIDIA graphics cards it seems, and more caused by NVIDIA's handling of DSC on their graphics cards. One thing we test in our reviews now is the support for NVIDIA DSR and DLDSR upscaling technologies. Sometimes these can work on displays with DSC, but sometimes they can't. And as a result, some display manufacturers have now started to add a DSC on-off toggle in their on-screen menu, so that you can disable DSC if you really want to use those features. Although on DP 1.4 connections, that does come at the cost of refresh rate. In theory, if a DP 2.1 connection was used, you could power some of these current screens without DSC being used at all, and therefore always have access to NVIDIA DSR and DLDSR upscaling technologies. Another DSC issue is that you can get a 2 to 3 second black screen delay when alt-tabbing out of full screen games that can be pretty annoying. Although in some cases you can get around that by playing in borderless window mode, but not every game supports that or works properly. This seems to be something that bothers a lot of people though, from the feedback that we've seen. More practical issues could arise, like limitations for daisy chaining screens, or sometimes signal image oddities or screen wake-up delays that we've seen, and they're also reported with DSC sometimes. All in all, the idea of dodging DSC and using an uncompressed signal via the new speeds that DP 2.1 can offer is an attractive idea, although it's not really the use case that the connection was designed for. It's more of a potential side benefit if manufacturers bother to adopt DP 2.1 instead of DP 1.4 to power some of the existing refresh rate and resolution combinations. Although it does come with added cost, development complications and scalar challenges, so it's unlikely to be widely used in that way we think. Eventually new specs will emerge and you'll then get beyond the point where you can use an uncompressed signal anyway, and you'll be right back to having to use DSC. This whole dodging DSC usage completely idea only really applies to the current top-end specs like 4K 240Hz or 1440p 480Hz for instance. Anything much higher than that is going to need DSC anyway, even using DisplayPort 2.1 at its full speed. Let's talk about the issues and problems though with all of this. Firstly, and this is a biggie, the specifications for DisplayPort 2.1 as defined by VESA are not what you might expect them to be. Let me explain. DP 2.1 can offer new bandwidth speeds above and beyond DP 1.4, and these are referred to as UHBR or ultra high bitrate. DP 1.4 operated with what VESA called high bitrate 3, with bandwidths up to 32.4 gigabits per second, although the actual data rate for sending signals from a graphics card to a monitor over that connection is only around 80% of that at 25.92 gigabits per second, as the signal encoding and overheads takes away a chunk of the full bandwidth. The new DP 2.1 connection confusingly has 3 tiers of this new UHBR speeds, which are labelled as UHBR 10, UHBR 13.5 and UHBR 20. You multiply each of these by 4 to calculate the total bandwidth available, although it would probably have been simpler had VESA just called them UHBR 40, 54 and 80 instead. You can see the bandwidths here supported by each UHBR tier, along with their data rate in the table on the screen. You might spot that the data rate is a higher proportion of the overall bandwidth here on DP 2.1, as the encoding is a lot more efficient than it was on DP 1.4, allowing for almost 97% of the bandwidth to be utilised now. So one area of confusion we're already seeing in the market is that when you see something labelled as DP 2.1, you also need to understand which UHBR speed it supports. You cannot assume that it will support the full 80 gigabits per second DP 2.1 bandwidth. Some manufacturers list this in their specs, but we've recently seen a lot of confusion and misinformation where DP 2.1 is promoted in press releases or on product launches. And then that in turn is poorly misunderstood in the market. Just because a screen is advertised as supporting DP 2.1 doesn't mean it will support the full bandwidth you might expect it to. A good example of this in action is the recently launched Sony InZone M10S OLED monitor. That's a 27-inch display with a 1440p resolution and 480Hz refresh rate. Their press release promoted DP 2.1, and you will see this picked up widely by media outlets and news sites as a key feature of this display. The hype begins and assumptions get made, and we've seen several places tout this as a big benefit, something that on paper initially makes it stand out against the competition like the already available ASUS ROG Swift PG27A which only has DP 1.4. Yay, I can use the screen without DSC, people think. Actually, if you look at the specs in detail, you will find that the connection only supports the UHBR 10 speed tier, so that's 40 gigabits per second bandwidth or 38.69 gigabits per second data rate. That's more than DP 1.4, sure, but it's less than HDMI 2.1, which is also available, and that's also available on other monitors like the ASUS model, which have DP 1.4. UHBR 10 isn't enough to support the uncompressed 1440p 480Hz, so you can't avoid DSC usage anyway. You'd need the full UHBR 20 speed for that, so it just feels pointless really. It doesn't offer any benefits that we can see to an end user, and in fact could introduce some risk that we'll talk about in a minute. There's benefits to Sony of course with marketing and hype, but we're already seeing a lot of people get confused and misled by this. It gets worse than this though, unfortunately. According to the VESA specification, for a connection to be called DP 2.1, it doesn't actually need to support any of the new UHBR speeds. The requirements for DP 2.1 certification counterintuitively do not even require the new speeds, which are such a huge focus of the marketing for this new connection, and it just seems mad. This feels like it could be open to potential abuse in the future, although thankfully we've not seen any signs of it so far. It's probably only a matter of time though, as we've already seen fake HDMI 2.1 connections in the past, even from big name suppliers. But in theory, and to the letter of VESA's spec and requirements, a manufacturer could list their display as supporting DP 2.1 even if it didn't actually support any of the new UHBR speeds. It needs to meet their other criteria, but when the new speeds are such a key part of what makes this connection what it is, this feels like a major issue to us. So when you see DP 2.1 advertised, you need to figure out which UHBR speed is supported, or actually, if any UHBR speed is supported at all. Let's just hope manufacturers don't abuse this and keep things clean like they've generally done for HDMI 2.1. The next issue is the key reason why DP 2.1 hasn't been widely adopted yet by display manufacturers, and we've only seen a handful of screens launched or announced with it so far. And that is the distinct lack of input source devices that have DP 2.1. In the PC monitor market, the adoption of a new connection has always been driven by the graphics card segment, and primarily by the two key vendors, Nvidia and AMD. If the connection is not available from graphics cards for display manufacturers to test and develop around, it makes it very difficult and also somewhat risky to feature it beforehand. AMD do have a couple of graphics cards that support DP 2.1, including their top-end consumer cards which have up to UHBR 13.5 speeds, and some professional and very expensive cards which can support the full UHBR 20 speeds. That at least allows some co-development of DP 2.1 displays, like we saw with the Samsung Odyssey G95NC, which needed DP 2.1 to power it and was co-developed with AMD using their UHBR 13.5 capable cards. Note, by the way, that even using UHB 13.5 on that screen needs to use DSC to support the massive resolution and refresh rate. Conspicuous by their absence so far then are Nvidia, who don't have any graphics cards yet with DP 2.1, although there's rumours and hope that this could appear with their RTX 5000 series when they're released. If a display manufacturer doesn't have a good range of graphics cards, especially on the consumer side of the market to test and develop their new displays with, it's very hard to adopt the new connection at all. It will be the graphics card manufacturers who put a stake in the ground in terms of how these connections will work, and then left to the many display manufacturers to build around that. If you add a DP 2.1 to a monitor now, Nvidia aren't going to mess around trying to make sure that their cards work with it properly and without bugs. You will have to go back and make adjustments and improvements to your display after the fact, which is not going to be very easy. We think this is a potential risk right now where DP 2.1 is being adopted, as there's no telling how these monitors will operate with the new cards when they do appear. It might require bug fixes, updates and further development, which isn't going to be an attractive proposition after a screen is already released to market. We continue to see bugs and issues with HDMI 2.1 even today on monitors, and that's been around for quite a long time now. Buying a screen with DP 2.1 now could be considered a risk, we think, until the input sources and devices are available and stable. Another related development challenge is on the monitor scaler side. DP 2.1 scalers do exist, but they're more limited in availability and features and more expensive than traditional DP 1.4 scalers. This adds to production costs and can lead to increases in display retail prices, which is not really very desirable in an ever competitive market. Sometimes you might have to make sacrifices with other connections, features, controls and that kind of thing. The display manufacturers just don't want to make just so that they can get DP 2.1. The scaler side of the market is still maturing and it will get better in time, but right now it's an additional challenge. The development of those scalers is also impacted, of course, by the lack of availability of the input sources like we just discussed on the graphics card side of things. This brings us to the final major problem with DP 2.1, and that's cable support. The physical connector is the same for DP 2.1, but to handle the higher UHBR speeds, a cable needs to be a higher quality and standard, which then comes at an increased cost, but also significantly, it impacts the cable length. You can't just use an existing DP 1.4 cable, unfortunately. Vaser have a certification scheme for cables that falls into 3 tiers, aligned to each of the UHBR tiers. Confusingly, the cables reflect the total bandwidth of the tier and are therefore 4 times the number of the UHBR tier. So UHBR 10 needs a DP 40 cable and so on. This scheme does at least allow you to more easily identify a cable that should support the DP 2.1 speed of your device properly. At the top end, there are some cables which can support the full 80 gigabits per second bandwidth of the UHBR 20 tier, which would be labelled as DP80. There are big challenges with getting these cables to work properly, especially if you want a passive cable as opposed to an active cable. There are severe restrictions at the moment on the length of the cable that you can support these speeds, with most being limited to 1 meter maximum. That's a very short cable, with many monitors nowadays shipping with a 1.5 to 2 meter cable. That's probably the kind of cable length that you're using right now for your monitor. Unless your PC is right next to your monitor, like if it's on the top of your desk, it's unlikely that 1 meter cable is going to be long enough for you. And that makes the adoption of DP 2.1 even more difficult. Right now, on the official VESA page for DP 2.1 cables, there are 54 products which have been certified for full-speed UHBR20 performance and are classified as DP80 cables. Nearly all of them are 1 meter or less in length. We counted only 3 cables which were slightly longer at 1.2 meters, which, looking at the specs on the manufacturer's websites, suggests that, as far as we could tell, they should also be compliant for UHBR20 speeds, like the couple of examples that are shown on the screen here. Those aren't much longer though, of course, and likely insufficient for many users. When checking Glorymark's website for their 1.2 meter cable listed on the VESA site, they also promote a 1.5 meter cable, which they claim is the world's first certified DP80 cable, although this isn't listed on VESA's certified list at the moment. Even if this cable does end up being formally certified, it still isn't particularly very long. One other manufacturer on the filtered list of DP80 cables lists cables that are 3 meters, 5 meters, or even 8 meters long, although they don't seem to have an official website, and we strongly suspect that anything longer than 1 meter will only work for lower UHBR speeds, or maybe only for older DP 1.4 signals, especially if it's a particularly long cable. We'd advise extreme caution with cables like this for UHBR20 speeds, which are clearly much longer than the others. For the lower UHBR speeds, 2 meters seems to be common for DP40 and DP54 cables, which is better news, and some of the lower speed cables can reach up to 3 meters if needed. It's just that top tier that is very restrictive right now in the cable support. Unfortunately, it's that top tier that is the one that's needed to support any of the current high resolution and refresh rates like 4K 240Hz or 1440p 480Hz without DSC and using an uncompressed signal. We haven't seen any monitor specs that have needed UHBR20 speeds with DSC yet. Even the massive Samsung 57-inch monitor only needs UHBR 13.5 at this time. You'll see a lot of misleading advertising out there for cables, so we'd recommend consulting VESA's official list at this time to choose a certified cable appropriate for the DP 2.1 connection speed that you want to use. We'd also recommend watching the excellent video over at Monitors Unboxed for loads more detail on DP 2.1 cables and the confusion that surround them. So, as you can see, there's some major issues with DP 2.1 right now. The take-home point is that if you see DP 2.1 advertised, you need to understand first of all which UHBR speed it supports, if indeed it even supports one at all, as technically it doesn't even have to have that to be certified. Always check for the UHBR speed to understand what capabilities are on offer. We really do hope that manufacturers don't start to abuse this certification and launch fake DP 2.1 products, which lack any of the new UHBR speeds. If you're after a DP 2.1 monitor, keep in mind the challenges around cable support, cost, and length right now, and the potential risks in choosing a screen that has been developed at a time where there are very limited number of input source devices and graphics cards, and before manufacturers like Nvidia have even released a DP 2.1 capable graphics card. Being an early adopter isn't risk-free, unfortunately. This whole situation will improve in time, of course, and once AMD more widely develop DP 2.1 cards and Nvidia launch their graphics card with this connection, we should see a rapid increase in the number of monitors supporting it too. That's what's really holding up the monitor side of things right now. We expect there'll be reluctance from display manufacturers to use it for displays that could just as happily work with DP 1.4 and DSC, to be honest, because of the expense, scalar support, concerns around cables, a more challenging and costly development, and the impact that this has on the final product retail price. There's very little reason to add DP 2.1 to something like 4K 240Hz screen, for instance, which can function with DP 1.4 and DSC, unless it's the full speed UHBR 20 tier, which adds even more complexity as we've explained in this video. Trying to dodge DSC to avoid a handful of DSC bugs and concerns isn't going to be a priority, we don't think. Adding DP 2.1 for the sake of it at lower tiers to some of these screens is pointless, we think, beyond marketing promotion, as it doesn't avoid DSC usage anyway, as we've seen from some of the early DP 2.1 marketed monitors already. Lower tier DP 2.1 could, however, be used for some lower spec screens to support uncompressed signals, although it's less likely again for the same reasons we've just discussed. DP 2.1 will obviously have to be adopted to support future specs like 5K 2K at 240Hz, for instance, that we already know are planned in the OLED panel market at some point, hopefully before too long. That would need the new UHBR speeds, as it's beyond DP 1.4 with DSC, although note that this new combination is already too high for uncompressed signals even on the top DP 2.1 tier, so that will need to use DSC to function anyway. As we showed earlier, the new specs will need DP 2.1, but they're also going to need DSC. All in all, bar a few outliers, we expect DP 2.1 to be added more to screens where it's actually necessary and required to power the resolution and refresh rate combination, as opposed to being added to screens where DP 1.4 could support it, like screens with today's specs. There's a lot to take in from this video. Hopefully you found it useful, but do let us know in the comments section below if you've got any questions. If you'd like to help support the content that we provide here at TFT Central, you can join our Patreon, link below, where you can also get various perks like early access to new reviews and access to our calibrated ICC profile database. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.